What if the legends of invisibility cloaks weren't just myth, but fragments of forgotten technology? For centuries, stories of vanishing garments have captivated imaginations, from the shimmering robes of ancient wizards to the high-tech stealth of modern science. But buried deep within Celtic folklore lies something even more intriguing. Tales that don't just describe magic, but something eerily close to real-world invisibility tech. Picture this: warriors draped in cloaks that bend light, shields that deflect attention, and veils that render the wearer unseen, not by sorcery but by something far more tangible. The Celts, renowned for their intricate metalwork and mysterious druidic knowledge, might have stumbled upon secrets we're only now beginning to understand. These aren't just wild fantasies. The ancient Irish epic The Táin describes heroes like Cú Chulainn wielding cloaks that make them vanish from sight, while Welsh legends speak of enchanted robes gifted by otherworldly beings. But here's the twist: what if these stories weren't purely imaginative? What if they were distorted memories of real techniques, lost arts of camouflage, optical illusion, or even advanced material science? The Celts were master craftsmen, working with metals and materials in ways that still baffle historians. Could their legends be hinting at something far more extraordinary than we've ever dared to assume? This is where myth and history collide. Today, scientists are closer than ever to creating real invisibility cloaks using metamaterials, substances engineered to bend light around objects. It sounds like science fiction, yet the principles echo descriptions from tales thousands of years old. So let's ask the thrilling question: did ancient Celtic storytellers preserve whispers of a technology far ahead of its time? Join us as we unravel these mysteries, tracing the threads between ancient epics and cutting-edge science. The truth might be stranger and more wondrous than anything we've imagined. Celtic mythology is a tapestry woven with threads of magic, mystery, and the unseen. Unlike the rigid pantheons of Greece or Rome, Celtic deities often existed in a liminal space, neither fully human nor entirely divine, shifting effortlessly between the realms of the natural and the supernatural. The Dagda, the all-powerful father figure, wielded a club that could kill with one end and resurrect with the other. The Morrigan, the shape-shifting goddess of fate, appeared as a crow on battlefields, whispering prophecies to warriors. And then there was Lugh, the master of all arts, whose brilliance knew no bounds. These weren't just gods, they were forces of nature, embodying the Celts' deep connection to a world where the boundaries between reality and the otherworld were porous, fluid. Magic wasn't just a plot device in these stories, it was the very fabric of existence. The Celts believed in parallel worlds, the otherworld, a realm of eternal youth and hidden wonders, accessible through sacred mounds or enchanted lakes. Objects from this world held extraordinary power: cauldrons that never emptied, swords that sang in battle, and yes, cloaks that could erase their wearers from sight. What's fascinating is how these myths describe such artifacts not as pure fantasy, but as rare, craftable treasures. The Druids, the intellectual and spiritual elite, were said to possess knowledge so advanced it bordered on the technological. They could control weather, speak to animals, and perhaps even manipulate light itself. This blurring of lines between magic and practicality is key. When Celtic legends speak of invisibility cloaks, they don't just wave a hand and say, "It was magic." They describe them as tangible objects woven with care, sometimes gifted by otherworldly beings, almost as if they were prototypes of something real. The story of the Faith Fireter, for example, tells of a mist or veil that could shroud warriors from sight, not through spells, but through some unseen property of the material itself. It's as if these myths are hinting at a forgotten science, a lost understanding of how to bend perception, and that's where the real intrigue begins. If the Celts viewed their world as a place where the extraordinary was merely hidden, not impossible, then perhaps their magic was just a way of explaining what they couldn't yet fully articulate. Advanced metallurgy, optical illusions, even early experiments with reflective surfaces, all of these could have been misinterpreted as supernatural by later generations. The Druids guarded their secrets fiercely, passing knowledge orally, leaving no manuals behind. What if their spells were actually formulas, their enchanted cloaks the result of meticulous craftsmanship? When myth and history blur this profoundly, the stories stop being just stories and start sounding like whispers of something far more extraordinary. The idea of vanishing from sight wasn't just a fleeting trick in Celtic lore, it was a recurring power woven into the very identity of its heroes and gods. Take the legendary Irish hero Fionn mac Cumhaill, who could cloak himself in a magical mist to evade enemies, or the Welsh figure Gwydion, a master of illusions who reshaped reality itself. These stories don't treat invisibility as some rare, unbelievable feat. It's presented almost as a skill, a craft, something that could be learned or engineered. And that's what makes them so fascinating. Unlike other mythologies where invisibility is granted by capricious gods or random chance, Celtic tales often describe it as something tied to objects, cloaks, shields, even words, as if the secret lay in the materials themselves. One of the most striking examples comes from the Mabinogion, where the wizard King Math Fab Mathonwy uses a veil of illusion to conceal his nephew Lugh Lord Gifts. The text describes it not as a spell chanted in a puff of smoke, but as a precise act, almost ritualistic, requiring specific conditions to work. This mirrors later medieval accounts of Druidic practices, where rituals were said to manipulate perception, bending light or sound to disorient observers. Could these stories be echoing real techniques? Ancient Celtic warriors were known to use psychological warfare, painting their bodies in eerie woad patterns, howling like animals in battle to terrify enemies. What if their invisibility was an extension of that, a combination of camouflage, misdirection, and perhaps even early optics, like polished shields reflecting sunlight to blind foes or create phantom images? Then there's the faith fiada, the mist of concealment from Irish lore, often invoked by druids to shield entire armies from view. Some scholars suggest this could describe a form of collective hypnosis, where rhythmic chants, smoke, and strategic positioning created the illusion of vanishing. Others point to natural phenomena like the sudden fogs that roll over Celtic landscapes, swallowing hills and forests in moments. To a superstitious observer, a band of warriors emerging from such a fog might seem to materialize from thin air. But the key detail in these myths is agency. The Celts didn't just stumble into invisibility, they controlled it. That distinction hints at something more deliberate, almost technological. Even the materials mentioned in these stories raise questions. The cloak of invisibility gifted to the hero Cormac mac Airt wasn't just enchanted. It was described as light as air yet impenetrable to sight, a phrasing that eerily parallels modern metamaterials designed to scatter light. Celtic metalworkers were centuries ahead of their time, crafting weapons and jewelry with techniques lost to the Romans. Could they have experimented with alloys or fabrics that played tricks on the eye? Without written records, we're left with tantalizing gaps. But the consistency of these tales across regions and centuries suggests more than just imagination at work. They read like fragmented instructions, a puzzle waiting to be solved. So where does that leave us? On one side, the skeptic's answer, clever storytelling heightened by oral tradition. On the other, a thrilling possibility that Celtic myths preserve faint echoes of real knowledge, distorted but not invented. After all, every legend has a seed of truth. And when those legends speak of vanishing acts with such specificity, it's worth asking, what were they really describing? A trick of the light, a warrior's cunning, or something far older and far more extraordinary hiding in plain sight? Among the most striking tales of vanishing cloaks in Celtic lore is the story of the Tarncap from the Ulster cycle, a garment said to belong to the warrior kings of ancient Ireland. This wasn't just a simple disguise, it was a tool of strategy woven into the fate of heroes. The legend centers on the rivalry between the warrior Cu Chulainn and his foster brother Ferdiad. In one pivotal moment, Cu Chulainn's ally, the druidess Scathach, gifts him a cloak that doesn't just hide his body, but seems to erase his very presence from the battlefield. The text describes it as a fabric spun from the twilight, clinging to the wearer like a second skin, bending shadows to its will. What's remarkable is how the cloak isn't treated as a deus ex machina. It's a finite resource with rules. It could only be used 3 times, and only by someone with the fur, the truth of men, a code of honor. This detail suggests the Celts saw such power as something earned, not randomly bestowed. The cloak's mechanics are eerily specific. When donned, it didn't just render the wearer invisible, it muffled sound, masked scent, and even dulled the glint of weapons, as if weaving silence into its folds. In one scene, Cu Chulainn uses it to infiltrate an enemy camp, moving like a whisper between watchfires. The guards feel a chill, a prickle of unease, but see nothing. This goes beyond mere superstition. It reads like an observation of how light and perception can be manipulated. Could this be a garbled account of an ancient stealth technique? Celtic metallurgists were known to create alloys with unusual reflective properties, and their textiles, like the famed brat, were layered for durability and weather resistance. What if the tarn cap was a real artifact, a cloak treated with dyes that absorbed light, or woven with fibers that scattered it? Even more intriguing is the cloak's symbolic weight. In the Ulster cycle, it's not just a tool but a test. When Cu Chulainn misuses it for a personal feud, the fabric tears, losing its power. The message is clear: true concealment required discipline. This parallels Druidic teachings, where knowledge was guarded not just for secrecy's sake, but because misuse could unravel its effects. Compare this to modern camouflage tech, where the goal isn't just to disappear, but to control how and when you're seen. The military today spends millions on adaptive invisibility, materials that shift with surroundings. The Celts, lacking our vocabulary, might have encoded similar principles in myth. Then there's the Welsh counterpart, the Cloak of Gwenhwyfar from the Mabinogion, said to be crafted from the threads of the last sunset. Unlike the tarn cap, this cloak didn't hide the wearer, it made others forget they'd been seen. One passage describes a knight wrapping himself in it, then walking through a crowded hall unnoticed. People's gazes slid right past him, as if their minds refused to register his presence. Modern psychology calls this inattentional blindness, where the brain filters out non-threatening stimuli. Did Celtic storytellers stumble onto a primal understanding of attention? Or were they documenting something more deliberate, like a garment designed to exploit gaps in human perception? The threads tying these legends together suggest more than coincidence. Whether through crafted materials, environmental manipulation, or psychological insight, the Celts seem to have grasped concepts we're only now quantifying. Their invisibility wasn't magic in the wand-waving sense. It was a craft, a techn lost to time. And that raises a haunting question: how much of their mythology was simply science waiting to be rediscovered? To the ancient Celts, the line between magic and technology wasn't just blurred, it might not have existed at all. What we dismiss as superstition today could have been their way of describing knowledge so advanced it defied simple explanation. The Druids, often portrayed as mystical priests, were far more than just ritual leaders. They were the scientists, philosophers, and engineers of their time, mastering disciplines that ranged from astronomy to herbal medicine with a precision that still impresses modern scholars. Consider their calendar, the Coligny fragments, a bronze tablet etched with intricate lunar cycles that rival the accuracy of Roman timekeeping. This wasn't magic, it was mathematics, observation, and meticulous record-keeping. Yet to outsiders, such feats seemed supernatural, fueling legends of druids who could control the heavens. Take their famed mastery of natural forces. Ancient texts describe druids summoning storms to repel invaders or conjuring fog to shield their people. At first glance, this sounds like pure myth until you examine the science behind weather manipulation. The Celts lived in regions where microclimates shifted dramatically, and certain highland passes were known to generate sudden mists when wind and moisture aligned. What if Druidic storm calling was actually an understanding of these patterns passed down through generations? Imagine a druid standing atop a sacred hill, timing an ambush to coincide with the evening fog rolling in. To an enemy, it would look like sorcery. In reality, it was applied meteorology, a precursor to modern environmental forecasting. The same principle applies to their legendary healing arts. Celtic medicine relied on plants like mistletoe, harvested with rituals so precise they seemed mystical. Yet modern research reveals these plants contain potent compounds. Viscotoxins in mistletoe, for instance, have documented anti-cancer properties. The Druids' magical cures might have been early pharmacology, their ceremonies a way of preserving fragile knowledge in an oral tradition. Even their so-called prophecies could reflect deep psychological insight. The ability to read a person's fate may have been a combination of acute observation, knowledge of human behavior, and strategic ambiguity, skills any modern psychologist would recognize. Perhaps most telling is how the Celts themselves categorized their craft. They didn't have a word for magic as a separate concept. Instead, they spoke of draught, a term encompassing skill, artistry, and esoteric knowledge. A blacksmith shaping a sword with unbreakable bronze wasn't just forging metal, he was channeling draught. A weaver creating a cloak that seemed to shimmer and vanish in certain light wasn't merely sewing, she was weaving draught into the fabric. This worldview didn't divide the natural from the supernatural. Instead, it treated extraordinary skill as an extension of the ordinary, a mastery of hidden laws. What does this mean for the invisibility cloaks of legend? If the Celts saw advanced technology as simply another form of draught, then their enchanted artifacts might have been prototypes of real innovation. A cloak that bends light could be the product of a weaver experimenting with layered dyes or metallic threads, creating optical effects that baffled observers. The famed faith-fired mist might have been a smoke screen, engineered from local minerals that produced dense, lingering vapors. Even the idea of glamour, the ability to alter perceptions, could stem from early psychology using posture, light, and sound to manipulate attention. This reinterpretation doesn't diminish Celtic achievements, it amplifies them. By viewing their magic as misunderstood science, we uncover a culture far ahead of its time, one that encoded its brilliance in stories to survive the ages. The Druids guarded their knowledge fiercely, not because it was supernatural, but because it was precious, a toolkit for thriving in a world they understood more deeply than we've credited. So when legends speak of warriors vanishing into thin air, we shouldn't ask, was it magic? Instead, we might ask, what did they know that we're only now rediscovering? The answer could rewrite not just myth but history itself. The forests and misty highlands of the ancient Celtic world weren't just backdrops for legends, they were active collaborators in the art of vanishing. Picture a warrior wrapped not in a magical cloak, but in the dappled shadows of an oak grove, his cloak dyed with earthy pigments that mimic the play of light through leaves. This wasn't sorcery, it was an early mastery of camouflage, honed by generations of hunters and scouts who knew how to disappear into the landscape. The Celts didn't need metaphors to explain invisibility, they lived it. Their environment offered a toolkit for concealment. Sudden fogs that swallowed entire valleys, the way moonlight could turn a standing stone into a ghostly sentinel, even the natural refractive properties of water in sacred pools that distorted reflections. These weren't just poetic images, they were observable phenomena that could be harnessed. Take the Celtic affinity for reflective surfaces. archaeologists have found polished bronze shields so finely crafted they could double as mirrors, their surfaces capable of throwing sunlight like a beacon or dazzling an enemy into blindness. In the right conditions, a warrior holding such a shield at an angle might seem to fragment into the landscape, his outline broken by glare. The same principle applies to their jewelry, intricate brooches and torques designed to catch and scatter light, creating distracting flashes that draw the eye away from the wearer's movement. These weren't mere decorations, they were functional tools of misdirection, ancestors of the modern dazzle camouflage used in military deception. Then there's the role of textiles. Celtic weavers were legendary for their skill, producing fabrics like the brat, a multi-layered wool cloak that could shed rain, retain heat, and when dyed with organic compounds like woad or lichen, blend seamlessly into specific terrains. The Tane describes warriors melting into forests, a detail that aligns eerily with the way certain natural dyes shift color under changing light. But the real genius might lie in how these cloaks were worn. Historical accounts note that Celts often draped their cloaks loosely, allowing them to billow or cling as needed, a technique that could disrupt the human silhouette, much like the ghillie suits used by modern snipers. Even the Celts' understanding of sound played a role in their vanishing acts. Their legends often mention silent steps or muffled movements, suggesting techniques to minimize noise. The bogs and peatlands of their homelands provided natural sound dampeners, while their leather footwear, often lined with fur or moss, would have deadened footfalls. Combine this with the Druids' reputed knowledge of acoustics, using chants or drum beats to mask troop movements, and you have a recipe for perceptual invisibility. A Roman chronicler once wrote of Celtic warriors seeming to rise from the very earth, a description that fits less with magic than with disciplined stealth. The most compelling evidence, though, lies in the Celts' own words. Their myths rarely attribute invisibility to divine intervention alone. Instead, they emphasize preparation, timing, and the clever use of surroundings. When the hero Cuchulainn evades capture by standing motionless in a river, letting the water distort his form, it's not a spell, it's an exploit of optics. When Druids shroud armies in mist, they're often described waiting for specific weather conditions, like the cooling of evening air over warm bogs. These stories read less like fantasy and more like field manuals encoding survival knowledge in allegory. So were the Celts' invisibility cloaks real. Not as literal fabrics woven from moonlight, but as a synthesis of environmental wisdom, craftsmanship, and perceptual hacking, they might have been far more tangible than we've assumed. In a world where every shadow and reflection could be weaponized, the line between technology and magic wasn't just thin, it was irrelevant. What mattered was the result, the ability to step into the unseen, not by defying nature, but by collaborating with it. And that's a kind of magic we're still learning to replicate today. Archaeological digs across Celtic territories have unearthed objects that challenge our assumptions about ancient technology, artifacts so precisely crafted, they hint at knowledge we're only beginning to decode. Among the most striking are the intricate bronze mirrors found in Britain and Ireland, their surfaces polished to a near-perfect reflectivity. These weren't just vanity items, their curvature suggests an understanding of optics that borders on the scientific. When angled correctly, such a mirror could scatter light in ways that distort or even erase the viewer's reflection, a trick that might explain legends of warriors who could step out of sight by manipulating their surroundings. One mirror from the Iron Age site of Birdlip, England, still retains its original luster after 2,000 years, a testament to metallurgical skills that rivaled Rome's. Could these artifacts have been prototypes for the mythical cloaks of invisibility, their effects exaggerated over centuries of storytelling? Then there's the mystery of Celtic textiles. Excavations at Hallstatt in Austria revealed fragments of fabric dyed with complex organic compounds, some woven so densely they repelled water like modern technical gear. But it's the colors that intrigue, shades of blue and green derived from woad and moss, hues that blend eerily well with forested landscapes. When paired with the loose, layered drape of a Celtic brat cloak, these fabrics wouldn't just conceal, they'd mimic the natural chaos of foliage, breaking up the human silhouette in ways primitive observers might deem supernatural. Recent experiments by archaeologists have shown that such cloaks, when worn in dappled sunlight, can reduce visibility by up to 70%, a number that edges unsettlingly close to the realm of myth. Perhaps most compelling are the Celtic weapons and armor designed not just for strength but for psychological impact. The Battersea shield, recovered from the Thames, is a masterpiece of repoussé metalwork, its surface covered in swirling, hypnotic patterns. Under sunlight, these designs would have created a disorienting shimmer, making the wielder's movements harder to track. Similar effects appear in the Carnax, a towering war trumpet shaped like a snarling beast. When blown, its bronze jaws amplified sound into a terrifying roar, but its polished interior also acted like a parabolic reflector, capable of projecting a warrior's voice unnaturally far or even creating phantom echoes. To an enemy force, the combination of flashing metal and disembodied noise might have felt like facing an army of apparitions. Even mundane tools hint at ingenuity repurposed for the extraordinary. Take the rotary quern stones used for grinding grain. Some were balanced so precisely they could spin with minimal effort. This understanding of mechanics might have extended to early smoke machines, hollowed-out logs filled with slow-burning peat and herbs, capable of producing dense, lingering fog when rolled into battle. Such tactics align with accounts of the faith Fireter, where druids were said to summon concealing mist not by incantations, but by striking the earth with staffs, a poetic description perhaps of triggering pre-placed smoke devices. The real smoking gun, though, lies in the Celtic reverence for natural phenomena. At the Navan Fort complex in Ireland, archaeologists found a structure aligned so precisely with the solstices. It created optical illusions during sunrise shadows that appeared to swallow entire walls. Nearby, deposits of mica, a mineral with reflective properties, suggest deliberate use in rituals. Could these have been early experiments in light manipulation? When Welsh myths speak of heroes wrapping themselves in cloaks woven from sunset rays, they might be referencing real attempts to harness such materials, their effects lost to time but preserved in metaphor. What emerges from these fragments isn't proof of literal invisibility, but something just as fascinating, a culture that blurred the line between craft and sorcery. The Celts didn't need magic to vanish. They had metallurgy, textiles, acoustics, and an intimate knowledge of their environment. Their legends weren't lies. They were the language of a people who saw technology not as gears and wires, but as an extension of the natural world's hidden potential. And in that light, their invisibility cloaks start to look less like fantasy and more like the birth of something we've spent millennia trying to rediscover. The Druids were far more than spiritual leaders. They were the intellectual elite of Celtic society, entrusted with knowledge so advanced it blurred the line between science and the sacred. Classical writers like Julius Caesar noted their mastery of astronomy, medicine, and natural philosophy, disciplines they guarded through decades of rigorous training. What makes their role particularly fascinating is how their practices intersected with the physical world. Take their legendary control over light and shadow. Pliny the Elder recorded Druids harvesting mistletoe with golden sickles during specific lunar phases, a ritual that sounds mystical until you consider the optical properties involved. The golden tool wouldn't tarnish, ensuring a clean cut, while timing the harvest to moonlight might have preserved the plant's potency by avoiding daytime heat. This wasn't just ceremony, it was meticulous environmental science disguised as magic. Historical accounts describe Druids conducting rituals in secluded groves or near sacred springs, spaces where natural phenomena could be amplified. The Roman poet Lucan wrote of forests where branches whispered secrets, likely referencing the way wind through certain trees created eerie, disorienting echoes, an early form of acoustic camouflage. Even their famed ability to summon darkness aligns with practical techniques. Burning specific resins like pine or birch bark produced thick, slow dissipating smoke that could cloak movements or distort perceptions. The Irish Tainbow Cuelge mentions druids chanting to thicken the air before battle, a detail that mirrors modern fog-generating tactics used in naval warfare. But the most compelling evidence lies in their architectural choices. Druidic sites like Anglesey in Wales or the Hill of Tara in Ireland were often positioned at optical, vanishing points, where the interplay of elevation and horizon lines made structures appear or disappear depending on the observer's angle. At Newgrange, a passage tomb older than the pyramids, the inner chamber floods with sunlight only during the winter solstice, a feat requiring precise astronomical alignment. Could such mastery of light and space have extended to personal concealment? The Gaulish Druids were said to wear white robes treated with luminescent lichens, causing them to glow faintly in low light. To an uninitiated observer, this might look like supernatural radiance, but in reality, it could have been a primitive form of adaptive camouflage, using bioluminescence to blend into moonlit landscapes. Their knowledge wasn't limited to passive observation. The Welsh Book of Taliesin credits druids with crafting words of concealment, phrases that, when chanted in specific tones, allegedly rendered listeners unable to perceive the speaker. Modern research into binaural beats and auditory masking suggests sound frequencies can indeed alter perception, drowning out certain stimuli. It's not impossible that druids discovered acoustic interference patterns, using rhythmic chanting or resonant instruments like the carnix to disrupt an enemy's situational awareness. Perhaps the most telling clue is how their knowledge was transmitted. Druidic teachings were never written down. They were encoded in poetry, knotwork, and layered allegories, a form of intellectual encryption. The Ogham script, often carved into standing stones, may have served as more than an alphabet. Some scholars argue its vertical lines, when arranged as shadow-casting markers, could function as primitive sundials or even light-bending grids. If true, this transforms Celtic myths of vanishing runes from fantasy into potential references to optical coding. By viewing druids through this lens not as magicians, but as proto-scientists, their legendary abilities take on new plausibility. Their magic might have been a combination of hyper-observant naturalism, sophisticated material engineering, and psychological insight, all veiled in symbolism to protect their power. When medieval texts speak of druids wrapping warriors in shadows like cloaks, we might be reading the poetic remnants of actual stealth technology, lost to time but preserved in the language of wonder. The Celts weren't alone in dreaming of vanishing cultures across the ancient world, wove invisibility into their myths, each adding unique threads to this universal human fantasy. Norse legends speak of the Tarnhelm, a helmet forged by dwarves that could shroud its wearer in shadows or transform them into animals. Unlike the Celtic cloaks tied to honor and natural forces, the Tarnhelm was a tool of subterfuge, often wielded by gods like Loki to sow chaos. Yet both traditions share a striking detail. These objects weren't gifts from the divine, but crafted by skilled hands, Norse dwarves and Celtic weavers alike, hinting that invisibility was seen as an art, not just a supernatural fluke. Greek mythology takes a different turn. Here, invisibility is less about craftsmanship and more about divine favor. Hades' helmet, gifted by the Cyclopes, doesn't just hide the wearer, it erases their presence entirely, a power he loans to heroes like Perseus. The Greeks framed invisibility as a godly privilege, something borrowed rather than earned. Yet even this distinction crumbles when you examine the story of Gyges, the shepherd who discovers a ring that cloaks him in shadow. Plato's retelling treats it as a moral test, contrasting sharply with Celtic tales where invisibility is neutral, a skill to be mastered. The difference reveals cultural values. To the Greeks, vanishing threatened order. To the Celts, it was another way to navigate a world alive with hidden layers. Further east, Japanese folklore offers an intriguing parallel. The kakuramino, or straw rain cloak, appears in tales like the tale of the bamboo cutter, where it renders peasants invisible to predatory nobles. Like the Celtic faith Fireter, it's tied to the marginalized, a tool for the powerless to evade oppression. But where Celtic invisibility often served collective survival, Japanese versions lean toward individual escape, reflecting societal hierarchies. Even the materials differ, straw versus wool, yet both humble, everyday substances transformed into something extraordinary. Then there's the Hindu Maya, a concept blending illusion and invisibility. Ancient texts describe sages using Maya to walk unseen, not through objects but through mental discipline, a stark contrast to the Celts' tangible cloaks. Here, invisibility lives in the mind, a skill honed through meditation. Yet both traditions share an underlying truth: the unseen isn't absent, just unnoticed. Whether through fabric or focus, these myths agree that reality has gaps, and those who know how to slip through them hold power. What unites these stories across continents and eras isn't just a shared imagination, it's a deep-rooted recognition of perception's fragility. From the Celtic warrior merging with mist to the Norse god laughing unseen in the shadows, these myths whisper the same lesson: seeing is never as simple as it seems. And that's why these tales endure. They don't just entertain, they articulate a primal human suspicion that the world is full of invisible forces, and sometimes the greatest magic is learning how they work. Modern science has brought us tantalizingly close to turning invisibility from myth into reality, and the secrets lie in the dance of light itself. At its core, visibility is just a trick of perception. We see objects because light bounces off them and into our eyes. But what if you could bend that light around something, like water flowing around a stone in a stream? That's the principle behind today's invisibility research, where scientists engineer materials to redirect light waves seamlessly. The most promising breakthroughs come from metamaterials, synthetic substances designed with microscopic structures that interact with light in unnatural ways. Picture a fabric woven not with threads, but with patterns smaller than a wavelength of light, creating paths for photons to detour around an object entirely. It's less like magic and more like building a roundabout for light, rerouting its path so the hidden thing leaves no shadow, no reflection, no trace. Now rewind 2,000 years. The ancient Celts had no microscopes or nanotech, but they did have an intimate understanding of natural optics. Take their polished bronze mirrors, capable of focusing sunlight into blinding beams, proof they grasped how surfaces could manipulate light. Could they have experimented further? Imagine a craftsman hammering a metal cloak with precisely spaced ridges, not realizing those tiny imperfections might scatter light just enough to blur the wearer's edges. Or consider their woad-dyed textiles. Certain organic pigments absorb specific light frequencies, a crude form of wavelength filtering. Pair that with the Celtic brat cloak's loose drape, and you have a rudimentary stealth fabric that disrupts the human silhouette against a forest backdrop. Then there's refraction light bending as it passes through materials, like a straw seeming to bend in a glass of water. The Celts revered natural crystals like quartz, carving them into amulets. While they wouldn't have known the physics, they might have noticed how certain stones distorted vision when held at angles. Anecdotes from Roman historians describe druids using seeing stones to glimpse the future. What if these were actually lenses repurposed to magnify or minify images, or even cluster light in ways that created localized mirages? The difference between a magic crystal and a primitive cloaking device might just be intent. But the most striking parallel lies in the Celts' environmental hacking. Modern military camouflage doesn't just rely on color matching. It uses shapes and shading to break up outlines, a technique called disruptive patterning. Celtic warriors painted their bodies in swirling woad designs eerily similar to today's digital camouflage. Even their architecture played tricks with perception. Standing stones like those at Callanish in Scotland cast elongated shadows that merge with the landscape at certain sun angles, creating optical illusions of voids. If they could engineer landscapes to disappear, why not apply that knowledge to personal concealment? The missing link might be their worldview. For the Celts, the natural and supernatural weren't separate, they were layers of the same reality. A druid observing light bending through mist wouldn't call it physics, they'd call it draught, the art of shaping the unseen. That perspective turns every phenomenon into a potential tool. A cloak that scatters light isn't technology to them. It's just another way the world works when you know its secrets. So while the Celts likely never held a metamaterial cloak, their myth suggests something just as profound. A culture that intuitively grasped principles science is still unpacking. They may not have had the vocabulary for refractive index or waveguide, but their stories of heroes vanishing into twilight, of fabrics woven from shadows, hint at observations we're now codifying into equations. After all, science often starts with noticing the impossible and asking, what if? The Celts were asking that question long before our labs existed. Their answers just came wrapped in legend. The Celts didn't just forge weapons, they sculpted light itself. Archaeologists have uncovered bronze shields so meticulously polished they could double as mirrors, their surfaces catching sunlight with a brilliance that borders on the supernatural. One such artifact, the famous Battersea Shield, still gleams after 2 millennia, its surface etched with hypnotic swirls that seem to ripple when tilted. These weren't just decorative patterns, they were engineered distractions. In battle, a warrior could angle his shield to flash sunlight into an enemy's eyes, creating momentary blindness or even the illusion of vanishing. The effect would have been startling. One moment a charging Celt, the next a disorienting burst of light, followed by empty space where the fighter should be. This mastery of reflection went beyond warfare. Celtic metalworkers crafted ceremonial cauldrons with interiors buffed to a liquid sheen, turning them into primitive projection surfaces. Imagine a druid standing over such a vessel, filled with water, manipulating torchlight to cast shimmering shapes onto mist, a crude but effective form of optical theatre. The Irish legend of the cogwaingt, or crane dance, describes ritualists wearing cloaks studded with reflective discs, their movements creating flickering patterns that confuse the sight of men. Modern experiments with reproduction artifacts suggest these discs, when spun or shaken, could produce strobe-like effects, disrupting an observer's ability to track motion. Even more intriguing are the rare sun discs, small, concave bronze plates found across Celtic Europe. Initially dismissed as ornaments, their precise curvature suggests a deeper purpose. When held at specific angles, they focus sunlight into tight beams, but they can also scatter light outward like a diffuser. A group of warriors carrying these could create a wall of glare, masking their numbers or even making individuals seem to flicker in and out of view. The Welsh Mabinogion mentions heroes cloaked in shattered light, a phrase that takes on new meaning when viewed through this lens. Then there's the mystery of the speculum stones. Roman accounts describe druids using blackened bronze or obsidian mirrors for divination, but their descriptions hint at something more. Pliny notes how these stones swallowed torchlight when placed in certain configurations, suggesting they absorbed rather than reflected light, an eerie parallel to modern, vantablack materials engineered to eliminate glare. Could the Celts have discovered primitive light-absorbing alloys through trial and error? Metallurgical analysis of Celtic artifacts reveals occasional use of antimony, a metal that dulls reflectivity when mixed with bronze. Applied selectively to a cloak's lining or a shield's edge, it might have helped break up the wearer's outline against dark backgrounds. The true genius of Celtic metallurgy lay in its marriage of art and physics. A brooch from the Lisnacrogga hoard in Ireland bears tiny, precisely spaced perforations that, when spun, create moire patterns, visual interference that tricks the eye into seeing movement where none exists. Pair this with their famed illusion cloaks, woven with metallic threads that catch and fracture light, and you have a recipe for perceptual deception. Modern stealth technology uses similar principles. The F-35 fighter jet's coating scatters radar waves much like those ancient brooches scattered sunlight. What emerges from these fragments is a culture that treated light as a malleable tool. Their mirrors, shields, and ornaments weren't just objects, they were interfaces between the seen and unseen. When myths speak of warriors stepping between the rays of the sun, we might be hearing echoes of real techniques passed down through generations of craftsmen who understood one profound truth: to vanish isn't to disappear, but to master how others perceive you. And in that, the Celts were centuries ahead of their time. The dense fogs that cling to the moors and valleys of Celtic lands weren't just weather, they were active players in the theatre of myth. In stories like The Voyage of Bran, heroes sail into realms shrouded in perpetual mist, where islands appear and vanish like mirages. These narratives don't treat fog as mere atmosphere, they portray it as a living veil, a gateway between worlds. But peel back the poetic language, and you'll find something grounded in geography. The Celts inhabited regions where microclimates conspired to create sudden, localized fogs. Blankets of vapor rising from bogs at dusk, or sea mists rolling inland with uncanny precision. To a people deeply attuned to their environment, these phenomena weren't random. They were tools as reliable as a sword or shield. Consider the strategic use of mist in the Táin Bó Cúailnge, where the warrior Fergus Mac Roich leads his army under cover of a druid's fog. The text describes it as a cloak thicker than wool, swallowing sound and sight alike. Modern meteorology offers a plausible explanation. Celtic lands are crisscrossed with peat bogs, which release methane and water vapor when disturbed gases that can thicken existing mist. A war party trailing cattle through such terrain might literally conjure their own cover, the trampled ground exhaling a concealing haze. Even the timing aligns. Many Celtic battles were fought at dawn or dusk, when temperature shifts amplified these effects. What the bards called magic could have been a keen understanding of how to weaponize weather. The psychological impact can't be overstated. Imagine standing on a hillside as an advancing fog blots out familiar landmarks, leaving only disembodied voices and the occasional glint of metal. Now imagine that fog arriving on command, summoned by your enemy's druids. The Roman historian Tacitus recounts Celtic tribes using infernal mists to disorient invading legions, a tactic so effective it fueled rumors of supernatural aid. But the real magic lay in observation. The Celts knew which valleys held mist longest, which wines carried sea fog, inland knowledge passed down through generations, refined into what seemed like sorcery. Even their sacred sites leveraged these elements. The Shia mounds, gateways to the otherworld, were often placed where geothermal activity met cold air, creating permanent mist rings. Visitors to places like Newgrange would have seen the tomb's entrance wreathed in vapor, the stones seeming to dissolve into the haze. This wasn't just ambience, it was stagecraft, reinforcing the idea that the boundary between worlds was thin here. Modern archaeologists have found evidence of controlled burns near these sites, suggesting druids may have augmented natural fog with smoke, intensifying the otherworldly effect. The key lies in the Celtic worldview. They didn't separate natural from supernatural. A fog that hid a raiding party was as much an ally as the warriors themselves. Their myths reflect this intimacy with elemental forces like the Welsh tale of Elelwyd ap Sil Coed, who conjures a mist to steal King Arthur's men. Significantly, Elelwyd doesn't chant spells, he waits for the right wind direction. That detail alone reveals the practicality beneath the poetry. Today, military units still train to exploit terrain and weather for concealment. The Celts were pioneers of that art, their legends preserving not just stories but survival strategies coded in metaphor. When their myths speak of breathing the mist of invisibility, we might be hearing the echo of an actual technique, a warrior's sigh of relief as the land itself conspires to keep him unseen. In Celtic mythology, the line between invisibility and shapeshifting wasn't just blurred, it was often non-existent. Take the Morrigan, the phantom queen who could appear as a crow one moment and a spectral warrior the next. Her transformations weren't just about changing form, they were about slipping between states of existence, becoming unseen not by vanishing but by becoming something else entirely. This interplay between shape-shifting and invisibility reveals something profound. To the Celts, transformation wasn't a party trick, it was a fundamental way of navigating a world where perception was fluid. When the hero Fionn mac Cumhaill dons a deer's hide to evade enemies, he isn't just camouflaged, he's rewritten the rules of how he's perceived. The hide doesn't simply disguise him, it alters the very way light interacts with his body, bending the gazes of those who search for him. This duality shows up in countless legends. In the Welsh Mabinogion, the sorcerer Gwydion doesn't just turn himself and his companions into deer. He makes them unseeable to their pursuers, not through literal invisibility, but by shifting their forms so completely that they become unrecognizable as humans. The tales emphasize sensory deception, the snap of twigs under hooves, the musky scent of fur, the way shadows cling to antlers. These aren't magical abstractions, they're meticulous details that echo modern stealth technology. Today's military ghillie suits mimic foliage not just in color but in texture and movement. Celtic shape-shifting myths might encode similar principles, where true concealment required inhabiting every aspect of a new identity. Even more telling are the mechanics behind these transformations. Unlike Greek myths where gods change shape with a thought, Celtic shapeshifters often rely on objects, cloaks of animal skin, enchanted brooches, or spoken incantations that seem less like spells and more like technical instructions. The Irish epic Táin Bo Cúailnge describes warriors rubbing themselves with a special salve to take on animal forms, a detail that sounds mystical until you consider ancient hunting practices. Indigenous cultures worldwide used animal fats and plant dyes to mask human scent and break up visual outlines. Could these transformation salves have been early attempts at multisensory camouflage? The Celtic emphasis on ritual-specific words spoken while applying the substance, precise timing tied to lunar phases, suggests a formula, a protocol to be followed for consistent results. The most compelling link lies in the shared limitations of both powers. Just as invisibility cloaks in Celtic lore often came with rules, only working at certain times or for those with pure intent shapeshifting carried similar constraints. The Celtic Legends of Scotland and Ireland describe seal people who could shed their skins to walk as humans, but if their skins were stolen, they were trapped. This isn't arbitrary myth-building, it's a narrative reflection of practical vulnerabilities. A disguise is only effective if maintained, and overconfidence breaks the illusion. Modern special forces know this intimately. The best camouflage fails if movement or sound betrays the wearer. Celtic myths might be preserving that lesson in allegory, teaching that true concealment requires discipline, not just tools. What unites these stories is the underlying concept of metamorphosis, not as fantasy, but as applied perception hacking. When the druid Taliesin sings of becoming a gust of wind or a drop in a lake, he's describing the ultimate goal of evasion, not just to hide, but to dissolve into the environment so thoroughly that you become part of its natural rhythm. That's a level of sophistication modern stealth tech still aspires to. Perhaps the Celts weren't just imagining the impossible. Maybe they were documenting a lost art of transformation, one where invisibility and shapeshifting were two sides of the same coin, both rooted in the science of being unseen. Folklore paints invisibility as a shimmering, otherworldly gift, cloaks woven from starlight, veils dipped in twilight, but history whispers something far more intriguing. The Roman historian Tacitus, no friend to the Celts, grudgingly noted their ability to step between shadows during raids, attributing it not to magic but to cunning and the lay of the land. His account aligns with archaeological finds, fragments of charcoal-darkened linen discovered near Scottish hill forts, suggesting stealth garments dyed to match nighttime terrain. The Irish Annals of the Four Masters describes 11th century warriors using mirrors of black bronze to signal silently across battlefields, a tactic that, when reversed, could have deflected attention rather than attracting it. The gap between myth and reality narrows when you examine how oral traditions evolve. A druid teaching scouts to blend into oak groves might describe it as wearing the forest's breath. Over generations, that metaphor could crystallize into tales of cloaks spun from leaves and wind. Take the Cath Mage Two-Wired, where the godlug disguises his army as trees by having them hold branches. Sounds fantastical until you learn that Celtic warriors actually strapped foliage to their shields in battle, a practice corroborated by Roman battlefield reports. What began as a tactical deception likely snowballed into legends of forests marching to war. Even the famous faith fired a mist described in myths as a divine veil finds echoes in historical tactics. The Lebagabala Eren recounts druids timing raids to coincide with coastal fogs, using brass horns to distort sound and amplify confusion. To an enemy, such precision might seem supernatural. But modern special forces employ identical principles, using weather forecasts and acoustic deception to mask movement. The key difference: the Celts lacked our vocabulary for environmental exploitation, so they called it magic. The most telling detail lies in what folklore omits. Legends rarely mention the failures, the cloaks that tore, the mists that lifted too soon, yet historical fragments hint at trial and error. A 1st-century Celtic graveyard in Gaul yielded a skeleton buried with a peculiar bronze headband, its interior lined with faint lens-like grooves. Nearby, a Roman dagger was found embedded in the wall directly opposite where the headband would have reflected sunlight. Coincidence or evidence of an early, imperfect cloaking attempt, abandoned after it literally backfired? This isn't to say the Celts had invisibility tech as we understand it, but their myths might preserve the essence of real techniques, polished by retelling until the practical became magical. When a Welsh bard sang of a cloak that drank the noon sun, he could have been describing an experimental dye that absorbed light too well. When Irish tales speak of shields that cast no shadow, they might recall polished surfaces angled to diffuse reflections. Oral tradition magnified these feats, but the core remains. A people who turned their world's whispers into weapons, then wove those secrets into stories to keep them alive. Recent experiments by historians and material scientists have brought Celtic invisibility out of legend and into the lab with startling results. In 2017, a team at University College Dublin attempted to recreate the legendary faith fire mist using only Iron Age materials. They layered damp straw over smoldering peat in a replica Druidic fire pit, producing a dense, slow-moving fog that reduced visibility to less than 3 feet within minutes. But the real breakthrough came when they positioned polished bronze shields around the smoke's perimeter. The reflected light created a disorienting shimmer effect, making figures inside the mist appear fragmented like a scattered reflection. Lead archaeologist Dr. Niamh Callahan noted, it wasn't true invisibility, but to someone unfamiliar with the technique, it would have seemed supernatural. Meanwhile, textile specialists in Scotland took inspiration from the Brat cloak's description in the Táin. Using traditional loom methods and organic dyes from woad, lichen, and iron-rich bog water, they produced a fabric that shifted color under different lighting conditions. When draped loosely over a moving subject in forested terrain, the cloak reduced detection rates by nearly 60% in daylight, a figure that jumped to 75% at twilight. The key lay in the uneven dye absorption, which mimicked the irregular patterns of foliage. Celtic weavers understood something modern camouflage engineers are still perfecting, noted textile historian Fergus MacLeod. The human eye doesn't just look for shapes, it searches for visual rhythm. Break that rhythm and you disappear. Perhaps the most ambitious experiment came from a joint physics and archaeology team in Wales, testing the reflective properties of Celtic mirror shields. Using exact replicas of the birdlip mirror's curvature and polish, they discovered that when two shields were angled precisely, they could project a distorted image of the background across a crouching warrior's body, a primitive form of active camouflage. The effect only worked within a 15-degree window and required absolute stillness, echoing myths where invisibility faltered if the wearer moved too quickly. Not all attempts succeeded. A much-publicized effort to recreate the Tarncap's light-bending properties using layered linen and resin-soaked horsehair failed spectacularly when the stiffened fabric proved too brittle to wear. But even failures revealed ingenuity. The resin mixture, derived from period-accurate pine tar and beeswax, unexpectedly absorbed ultraviolet light, making the wearer invisible to modern night vision scopes. As experimental archaeologist Dr. Elena Shaw observed, the Celts might not have understood UV light, but they'd have noticed how certain treatments made hunters harder to spot at dawn. What these experiments collectively reveal is a culture working at the boundaries of their era's understanding. Where modern engineers used nanotechnology to bend light, the Celts used peat smoke and polished bronze. Where today's militaries develop adaptive camouflage fabrics, they layered organic dyes and loose weave wool. The gap between myth and history narrows when you realize both are asking the same question: how can we vanish in plain sight? The Celts answered with the materials they had, and the results were apparently convincing enough to echo through centuries of storytelling. The most potent weapon in any warrior's arsenal isn't a blade or a shield, it's the mind of their enemy. For the Celts, invisibility wasn't just a physical trick, it was a psychological storm meticulously crafted to unravel an opponent's certainty. Imagine standing in a mist-choked valley, hearing war horns echo from all directions, yet seeing no foes, only flickering shadows that might be trees or men or something else entirely. This was the Celts' mastery, weaponizing doubt. Classical writers like Strabo noted their battles began with unearthly howls and sudden silences, a cacophony designed to disorient before the first strike. The goal wasn't just concealment, it was to make the enemy question their own senses, to turn the landscape itself into a conspirator. Druids amplified this effect with rituals that blurred the line between spectacle and strategy. The Tain describes warriors circling fires in cloaks stitched with reflective discs, their movements synchronized to create a strobe-like ripple of light. To an observer, this wouldn't just hide numbers, it would fracture perception, making 10 men seem like 50 or none at all. Roman accounts of Celtic battles mention soldiers attacking the air, swinging at phantoms as their adversaries shifted position under cover of smoke or mirrored glare. These weren't chaotic skirmishes, they were psychological operations centuries ahead of their time. Fear thrived in the gaps of understanding. The Celts knew this intimately. Their famed carnix, a war trumpet shaped like a beast's maw, didn't just signal attacks. Its shuddering drone could mimic distant thunder or animal screams, warping an enemy's sense of space and direction. Pair that with warriors emerging from fog in flickering torchlight, their bodies painted in woad's hypnotic swirls, and you have a recipe for primal terror. Tacitus recounts legionnaires freezing mid-charge, convinced they faced not men but demon spirits who could slip between worlds. Even off the battlefield, invisibility served a deeper purpose. At sacred sites like Tara, druids staged rituals where initiates seemingly vanished into standing stones, only to reappear elsewhere. These theatrics weren't mere tricks, they were lessons in perception's malleability. A chieftain who'd witnessed a druid dissolve into mist would later see that same uncanny potential in every shadow on the march. The Celts didn't just use invisibility, they weaponized the very idea of it until their enemies feared the air itself might betray them. This psychological edge had tangible consequences. Caesar wrote of Celtic tribes appearing as if multiplied by enchantment, their forces seeming to replenish from nowhere. In truth, it was likely rotating warriors behind smokescreens or using terrain to mask retreats and reinforcements. But the effect was the same. Opponents exhausted themselves fighting mirages, their morale crumbling under the weight of imagined numbers. The brilliance lay in the Celts understanding that invisibility isn't about absence, it's about controlling what others think they see, and in that they were unmatched. Modern militaries still study these principles. The confusion matrix taught to special forces using light, sound, and movement to overload an enemy's cognitive processing mirrors Celtic tactics eerily. The difference, where today's soldiers have technology, the Celts had something just as powerful, an intimacy with the natural world's illusions and the creativity to turn them into warfare. Their invisibility wasn't magic, it was the art of making doubt their ally and fear their silent weapon. Celtic knotwork isn't just decoration, it's a language. Those intricate, never-ending loops winding through ancient manuscripts and stone carvings hold secrets beyond aesthetics. Take the famous Book of Kells, where interwoven patterns create optical illusions, their paths seeming to vanish and reappear as the eye travels across the page. This isn't random artistry. Scholars have noted how certain designs mimic the behavior of light under specific conditions, like the way a cloak's folds might scatter sunlight to obscure its wearer. The Trinity knot, with its 3 arcs flowing seamlessly into one another, mirrors the perceptual tricks described in myths where heroes slip between seen and unseen states. Could these patterns be more than symbolic? Could they be diagrams, visual instructions for manipulating perception? Deeper in the symbolism lies the recurring motif of the void. Celtic artists often left deliberate gaps in their designs, negative spaces shaped like arrows or spirals that draw the eye away from the focal point. On the Gundestrup cauldron, a warrior's cloak is etched with such voids, creating a visual rhythm that fractures his outline. Modern camouflage experts call this disruptive patterning, the use of contrasting shapes to break up recognizable forms. The Celts didn't have that terminology, but their art suggests an intuitive grasp of the principle. Even their jewelry played this game. Torques with alternating polished and matte surfaces created flickering effects in firelight, making the wearer's movements harder to track. Then there's the enigmatic shield knot, often carved onto weapons and armor. While commonly interpreted as a protective charm, its structure, a labyrinth of lines with no clear entry or exit, echoes descriptions of the faith fired mist in legends. When drawn on a shield, the knot's twisting paths could have disoriented enemies in battle, their gaze trapped in the design's maze while the warrior moved unseen. Archaeological finds support this. Shields from the Latine period bear traces of iron oxide mixed with animal fat, creating reflective surfaces that would have amplified the knot's dizzying effect under sunlight. Perhaps most telling are the hidden layers in Celtic art itself. Many illuminated manuscripts, like the Lindisfarne Gospels, contain invisible ink mineral-based pigments that only appear under certain angles of light. Initial letters might seem plain until tilted toward a candle, revealing hidden beasts or faces. This technique mirrors the drayot described in tales where knowledge, or the bearer, only appears to those who know how to look. The parallels are too stark to ignore. When myths speak of words written in twilight, they might be referencing literal practices where art and concealment were 2 sides of the same coin. The ultimate clue lies in what Celtic artists didn't depict. Unlike Greek or Roman art, which glorified the human form, Celtic works often fragment bodies into patterns, a hand merging with vinework, a face dissolving into spirals. This wasn't stylistic whim, it reflected a worldview where boundaries were fluid. If a craftsman could carve a man turning into leaves on a stone pillar, why couldn't a warrior clad in the right cloak become one with the forest? Their art doesn't just depict invisibility, it enacts it, training the eye to see disappearance as another form of beauty, and that might be the most profound technology of all. Stories change with every telling. A warrior's clever use of a fog bank becomes a druid summoned mist over generations. A cloak dyed to blend into forest shadows transforms into fabric woven from twilight itself. This is the alchemy of oral tradition where practical knowledge, passed down through spoken word, gradually sheds its earthly origins and takes flight as legend. The Celts left no instruction manuals for their stealth tactics, only echoes preserved in epic poetry and bardic tales. But within those echoes, we can still hear the faint heartbeat of reality, pulsing beneath layers of embellishment. Consider how memory works. When a scout returns to his village and describes evading enemies by crouching motionless in a peat bog, his account focuses on the outcome: he vanished. By the time his grandson recounts the tale, the details simplify. No mention of the bog's natural cover, just a hero who became as the marsh itself. Another generation, and the story might feature a magic cloak gifted by the gods. This isn't deception, it's the natural compression of oral storytelling. Survival skills become supernatural gifts because the how fades, leaving only the dazzling what. The Irish Dincenture's lore explaining place names often roots myths in observable phenomena. A hill where fog lingers unusually long might spawn tales of a sleeping giant's breath, and any tactic exploiting that fog morphs into communing with spirits. The rhythm of storytelling accelerated this transformation. Celtic bards didn't recite dry reports, they performed, using vivid metaphors to make deeds unforgettable. A warrior smearing mud on his face to break up his silhouette might be described as rubbing the night upon his skin. Listeners centuries later, hearing the poetic version without context, would assume literal magic. Skilled bards also tailored tales to their audience. A chieftain might hear a tactical breakdown, while children were told of enchanted cloaks. Over time, the simplified version survived, carried further by travelers, and retold more often than the technical originals. Even the structure of Celtic myths reflects this evolution. Many tales follow a threefold pattern. A hero attempts a feat twice in failure before succeeding on the third try. Scholars suggest this mirrors real trial and error learning. Imagine an early account. We tried hiding at noon, but our shadows betrayed us. At dusk, the angle was wrong. Then we waited for moonrise, and it worked. Generations later, this becomes the druid's cloak failed twice before the third casting drew power from the moon. The practical lesson: timing matters endures, but the method shifts from observation to incantation. Language itself conspired to mystify the mundane. Old Irish has multiple words for different types of concealment. Follach for hiding objects, sealed for personal stealth, firedach for blending into wilderness. As these terms faded with Christianization, later scribes translating ancient texts often rendered them all simply as magic. A description of a sealed expert, someone skilled in moving unseen, might become a wizard who walks without footprints. The same happened with tools. A scathon, originally any polished reflective surface, appears in medieval manuscripts as a seeing stone with otherworldly powers. Yet the roots still show. In the Akalam Nosenorach, an ancient warrior casually mentions using a cloak of grey and green strands to stalk deer, a detail so specific it feels lifted from real experience. But in the same text, another character dons a cloak that shimmers like a salmon's side, clearly veering into metaphor. The two descriptions exist side by side, capturing oral tradition mid-transformation. Even the famous Tainbow Cuelge contains moments where the magical falters, cloaks tear when misused. Mists disperse if improperly timed, hinting at underlying mechanics not fully erased by poetic license. Perhaps most telling are the inconsistencies. If invisibility were purely mythical, every story would treat it the same way. Instead, we get wildly varying accounts: cloaks that work only at certain hours, shields that deflect gazes but not arrows, veils that fool humans but not dogs. These discrepancies suggest multiple real techniques, each remembered differently. A mirror shield's glare might inspire one tale, while a hunter's ghillie suit spawns another. Oral tradition preserves not a single truth but a spectrum, each refraction revealing another facet of the original practice. The final layer of transformation came with Christian scribes recording these pagan tales centuries later. A druid timing a raid to the fog season might become a saint praying for divine mist. The Vita Columbi describes the missionary Columba rendering a fugitive invisible to pursuers. A clear echo of older faith-fired legends now repurposed for a new faith. Yet even here, the core remains, the idea that invisibility wasn't supernatural, but a skill attainable through knowledge. What emerges from this evolution isn't a loss, but a translation. The Celts encoded their understanding of light, terrain, and perception into stories durable enough to outlast empires. Their magic was the language of a people who knew the world hides more truths than it reveals, and that sometimes the best way to preserve a secret is to wrap it in a legend. As Christianity swept across Celtic lands, the old stories didn't vanish, they transformed. Medieval scribes, often monks tasked with preserving pagan lore, rewrote invisibility myths through a new spiritual lens. The cloak that once bent light became a symbol of divine favor. The Druids' mist now smelled of incense rather than peat smoke. In the Leber na Uada, an 11th century Irish manuscript, the hero Cuchulain's concealment is no longer just tactical, it's framed as a test of faith. Where earlier versions describe him donning a cloak to ambush foes, the medieval text adds a priestly figure who blesses the garment, tying its power to Christian virtue. This wasn't mere editing, it was cultural alchemy, blending old magic with new theology. Welsh texts like the Mabinogion show even subtler shifts. The cloak of Gwenhwyfar, which once manipulated memory, becomes a tool for moral lessons. In one retelling, a knight uses it not for battle, but to observe courtly intrigues unseen, a narrative twist that turns stealth into a means of exposing sin. The Otherworld, once a neutral realm of the Shia, now carries hints of purgatory, its mists thinning for the virtuous but thickening around the wicked. Even the famous faith-fired mist undergoes a rebrand. Where Druids once called it, saints now pray for it, as in the life of St. Patrick, where the saint shields his followers from raiders with a miraculously timed fog. Yet some adaptations reveal fascinating compromises. The Yellow Book of Lecan preserves a tale where a warrior's invisibility cloak retains its pagan origins, but gains a Christian catch. It fails if the wearer breaks an oath sworn on relics. This hybrid logic mirrors the syncretism of early medieval life, where holy wells still bore the names of forgotten gods. Even the mechanics of vanishing change. Where Celtic myths emphasized environmental tricks, medieval versions lean toward divine intervention. A shield that once scattered light through careful polishing now gleams by the grace of God. As one chronicle puts it, the most striking evolution lies in who gets to vanish. In pre-Christian tales, invisibility is a democratized skill, crafted by weavers, learned by hunters. By the 12th century, it's increasingly reserved for saints and kings. The Annals of Ulster recount how High King Brian Boru supposedly wore a cloak that rendered him unseen to assassins, a detail absent from earlier accounts, grafting Celtic stealth onto a Christian ruler's divine right. Meanwhile, ordinary folk who disappear in these later texts often do so as punishment, like the lovers in the pursuit of diarmuid and grain, cursed to wander invisible as penance for their affair. But traces of the old wisdom linger. Between the lines of sermons and saints' lives, you can still find echoes of practical knowledge. When the Triads of Ireland mention three things that confound the eye, a druid's fog, a craftsman's mirror, and a harper's trance, it's a coded nod to the original trio of light, sound, and psychology. Even at the height of medieval piety, the Celts' genius for perceptual hacking refused to fade entirely. It just learned to speak in hymns. Some modern retellings of Celtic myths portray invisibility cloaks as all-powerful artifacts, granting their wearers flawless concealment at all times, but the truth is far more nuanced. Archaeological evidence suggests these legendary objects weren't magical talismans so much as highly specialized tools, effective only under precise conditions. For instance, the idea that a single cloak could render someone invisible in broad daylight contradicts both physics and historical accounts. Excavations of Celtic sites revealed textiles dyed with organic pigments that would have worked best at dawn or dusk, when light is softer and shadows longer. A cloak blending seamlessly into twilight undergrowth would stand out starkly against noon's harsh glare, a limitation subtly acknowledged in myths where heroes time their movements to specific hours. Another persistent myth claims these cloaks were mass-produced for entire armies, yet surviving fragments from bog deposits show these garments required painstaking craftsmanship, some woven with metallic threads or layered with rare lichen dyes. The Tain explicitly mentions only champions receiving them, suggesting scarcity. Even the famed faith fighter mist wasn't some ubiquitous spell. Roman military logs note its use only in terrain with natural fog patterns like river valleys or peatlands. This aligns with Druidic knowledge being situational, a far cry from the fantasy trope of wizards conjuring concealment anywhere. Perhaps the most stubborn misconception is that invisibility equaled invincibility. Legends repeatedly undercut this. Cu Chulain's cloak tears when misused, and Welsh tales tell of heroes betrayed by their own reflections in water. Real-world parallels exist too. A reconstructed Celtic brat cloak, tested in woodland settings, proved ineffective if the wearer moved abruptly, exactly the caveat described in the Acalam na Senorach, where swift footsteps break the illusion. Modern experiments with replica mirror shields show similar constraints. Their light-bending effects only work within narrow angles, explaining why myths often specify standing between sun and foe. Then there's the romanticized notion that these technologies were lost because of some ancient cataclysm. In reality, their decline was practical. As Celtic societies Romanized, heavy wool brat cloaks gave way to linen tunics unsuitable for dye-based camouflage. The Druidic oral tradition, which preserved stealth techniques through coded poetry, fragmented under Christianization. By the medieval period, these skills were repurposed. Hunters still used fog and foliage to stalk game, but the artistry of large-scale perceptual warfare faded into legend. The deepest irony, many modern stealth innovations unknowingly echo Celtic principles. The U.S. military's adaptive camouflage research cites 19th-century accounts of Scottish Highlanders using tartan to disrupt silhouettes, a direct descendant of Celtic patterning. Even metamaterials engineered to bend light mirror the layered weaving of Tain-era cloaks designed to scatter attention. What we dismiss as ancient superstition often turns out to be observational science in narrative disguise, waiting for us to decode its true meaning. The whispers of Celtic invisibility have never truly faded, they've simply shape-shifted, weaving themselves into the fabric of modern storytelling with a persistence that proves their power. From the pages of fantasy novels to the glow of blockbuster screens, the idea of vanishing cloaks and cunning mist lingers like the Druidic fog it once invoked. Consider J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series, where the Cloak of Invisibility is a prized heirloom passed down through generations, a direct echo of Irish sagas where enchanted cloaks were gifts from the otherworld. But Rowling's twist is telling. Her cloak's perfect concealment reflects our modern longing for flawless invisibility, a far cry from the Celtic versions that came with caveats and conditions. The adaptation reveals how ancient themes are sanded smooth for contemporary tastes, trading the messy realism of peat smoke camouflage for the clean magic of a child's fairy tale. Video games, too, have plundered these myths for their immersive potential. In The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, Geralt encounters the Faithfinder rebranded as Druid's Veil, a potion that shrouds him in mist, but only if he moves slowly, mirroring the limitations of the original legends. The game's developers didn't just borrow the aesthetic, they honored the Celtic understanding of invisibility as a skill, not a cheat code. Even Assassin's Creed Valhalla, set against the backdrop of Viking invasions of Britain, nods to Celtic stealth tactics. Eva's ability to blend into crowds, a mechanic borrowed from earlier entries, gains new resonance when you consider the historical Celts using mirror shields to fragment their visibility in battle. Here, pop culture becomes an unwitting archaeologist, piecing together forgotten truths beneath layers of entertainment. Films often take more liberties, but the DNA remains. In Pirates of the Caribbean, on stranger tides, the Fountain of Youth is guarded by a chalice that renders its drinker unseen, a plot point lifted from Welsh myths where sacred vessels held powers of concealment. The movie's watery, shimmering effects evoke the Celtic link between mist and vanishing, even if the lore is diluted for mass appeal. More faithful is the Irish animated film The Secret of Kells, where young Brendan's journey mirrors the voyage of Bran, complete with forests that breathe illusion and cloaks woven from twilight. The animation style itself, inspired by illuminated manuscripts, becomes a kind of visual drayoct, bending perception through artistry just as the Celts did with craft. Why does this theme endure? Perhaps because invisibility speaks to something primal in the human psyche. The desire to observe without being seen, to navigate dangers unseen, or simply to escape the weight of being perceived. The Celts framed it as a collaboration with nature. Modern stories often make it a rebellion against oppression. In The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, the protagonist's curse, being forgotten by everyone she meets, twists the Faithfinder into a metaphor for erasure and resilience. Neil Gaiman's American Gods resurrects the Morrigan as a shape-shifting drifter, her ability to vanish into crowds a survival tactic in a world that no longer worships her. These reinterpretations prove the flexibility of the source material. Celtic invisibility wasn't a monolith, but a spectrum of ideas about perception and power, ripe for reimagining. Even superhero sagas borrow from this well. Marvel's Black Panther gives Shuri vibranium-powered camouflage that recalls the mirror shields of Celtic warriors, while DC's Wonder Woman 1984 introduces an invisibility sphere that owes more to Druidic mist than sci-fi. The key difference: modern tech replaces nature as the catalyst, yet the underlying thrill remains the same, the awe of watching someone step between worlds. The true legacy of these myths lies in their adaptability. They've survived not as rigid dogma, but as narrative seeds sprouting differently in each era's soil. When a Dungeons & Dragons player dons a cloak of elvenkind, they're channeling the same wonder Cuchulainn felt wrapping himself in twilight. When a Netflix fantasy series dresses its rogue in a shadow-weave mantle, it's stitching together threads spun centuries ago by Celtic bards. The stories change, but the core truth endures. Invisibility isn't about disappearing, it's about redefining how you're seen. And in a world more watched than ever, that's a magic we still crave. For the Celts, invisibility wasn't just a tactical advantage, it was a responsibility. Unlike modern debates that frame stealth technology as inherently neutral, their myths suggest a nuanced ethical framework tied to honor and intent. Take the Tain Bo Cuelnge, where Cuchulainn's cloak fails when used for personal vengeance but shields him flawlessly in defense of his people. This distinction mirrors today's dilemmas. Is invisibility justified when protecting the vulnerable, or does it become dangerous when wielded for unchecked power? The Celts might have answered with their concept of fur, the truth of men, a code demanding that concealment serve collective survival, not individual gain. Compare this to contemporary surveillance. Modern governments argue that mass data collection prevents harm, much like a druid's mist shielding a village from raiders. But where the Celts limited such power to crises, cloaks were reserved for battles, not everyday espionage. Today's surveillance operates perpetually, blurring the line between protection and intrusion. The Welsh tale of Elelwyd ap Cilcod warns against misuse. His enchanted mist, meant to reclaim a stolen artifact, spirals into chaos when deployed selfishly. Sound familiar? It's the same tension fueling protests against facial recognition tech, where the tool's potential for public safety wars with its erosion of anonymity. Even the materials themselves carried moral weight. Celtic cloaks were often described as gifts from the otherworld or crafted by druids after rites of purification, implying that the right to vanish wasn't earned lightly. In contrast, today's invisibility tech emerges from corporate labs, patented and sold to the highest bidder. The Mabinogian's Gwen Whiffar loses her memory-altering cloak when she breaks an oath, while modern firms face no such checks when their algorithms strip users of privacy. The difference highlights a cultural shift. The Celts saw concealment as a sacred trust, while we treat it as a commodity. Yet both eras share a core dilemma: the ethics of perception control. When Roman historians accused druids of hiding like brigands, they echoed today's critics who label encryption tools as weapons for criminals. But the Celts understood a subtler truth: invisibility isn't inherently good or evil. It's a mirror reflecting the intentions of those who wield it. Their legends remind us that the real question isn't whether we can disappear, but whether we should, and who gets to decide. As we grapple with AI-driven surveillance and deepfake deception, those ancient stories feel less like myths and more like cautionary tales, whispering across millennia that the power to vanish demands wisdom as much as skill. For all we've uncovered about Celtic invisibility, the legends still hold onto their deepest secrets: whispers of techniques lost to time, artifacts buried beneath bogs, and knowledge that may have vanished with the last druids. One tantalizing mystery revolves around the legendary Cloak of Three Folds, mentioned in the Book of Leinster. Described as a garment woven from threads of dusk, dawn, and midnight, it reportedly shifted properties with the sun's arc. Was this poetic exaggeration, or could it hint at an early understanding of photochromic materials, fabrics that change with light exposure? Modern experiments with algae-based dyes have shown similar reactive qualities, but no archaeological find has yet matched this description. The closest discovery comes from a peat bog in County Offaly, where a fragment of Bronze Age wool was found infused with crushed galena crystals, a mineral known to refract light unpredictably. Was this the raw material of a forgotten technology? Then there's the enigma of the silent shields. Multiple Irish annals reference warriors carrying shields that swallowed sound, baffling enemies who couldn't hear their approach. Recent acoustic studies of Celtic Bronze Age shields reveal a peculiar property. When struck at certain frequencies, their concave shapes can dampen echoes, creating a localized, quiet zone. But could this have been intentional? A dig near Loch Tay uncovered a shield boss etched with spiral patterns matching soundwave diagrams, an uncanny coincidence that raises more questions than answers. Were the Celts experimenting with acoustic stealth centuries before noise-cancelling tech? Perhaps the most haunting gap lies in the Druids' oral traditions. Classical sources claim they memorized knowledge in triads, three-line verses designed to preserve complex ideas. Some scholars believe these contained coded instructions for everything from herbal medicine to light-bending illusions. A surviving triad from Wales cryptically states, "Three things that vanish: the hare in the bracken, the salmon in the pool, the word spoken into the hollow oak." Could hollow oak refer to a resonance chamber, a device to amplify or muffle sound? The recent discovery of oak barrels lined with beeswax in a Gaulish well suggests acoustic experiments, but without the Druids' living context, we're left deciphering fragments. Even the landscapes hold unsolved clues. At the Hill of Tara, a standing stone aligns with the sunrise on Beltane, casting a shadow that perfectly bisects the ancient Cloak of Kings earthwork. Local lore claims this was once a day of vanishing, when initiates could walk the shadow's path unseen. Physics confirms the angle would create a blinding glare, but was there more to the ritual? Nearby, archaeologists found pits filled with burnt quartz, a mineral that, when heated, emits infrared light invisible to the naked eye. To a culture attuned to nature's subtleties, might this have been a form of thermal camouflage? The greatest mystery of all may be how much knowledge was erased. Roman accounts describe burning Druidic groves and scattering their cursed mirrors. How many optical secrets were lost when those polished bronze discs were melted down for coins? A first-century graffiti in Pompeii oddly depicts a Celtic warrior dissolving like smoke, evidence that their reputation for vanishing crossed borders. Yet without primary sources, we're left piecing together rumors and relics. These gaps aren't just academic, they're invitations to explorers, scientists, and dreamers. What if the next peat bog excavation reveals a cloak lined with metallic fibers? Could some farmer's field hold the lost night glass the Ulster cycle claims could bend starlight? The Celts left us a puzzle written in mist and metal, waiting for the right light to reveal its patterns. And that's the magic of these legends. They refuse to be fully seen, even as they beckon us to look closer. The most compelling evidence linking Celtic invisibility myths to real-world technology lies in the striking parallels between ancient descriptions and modern scientific principles. Take the legend of the Tarncap, the vanishing cloak from the Ulster cycle, said to scatter light and muffle sound details that align uncannily with today's metamaterials research. Scientists now engineer fabrics embedded with microscopic structures that bend light waves around objects, while acoustic metamaterials can silence footsteps by cancelling sound frequencies. The Celts, with their mastery of metalwork and textiles, might have stumbled upon crude versions of these effects through trial and error. A cloak woven with uneven, reflective threads could diffuse light in ways that blurred the wearer's outline, while layers of wool and animal hide might have dampened sound technologies impressive enough to be immortalized as magic. Equally telling are the recurring conditions tied to these myths. Invisibility rarely worked flawlessly. It depended on timing, terrain, or the wearer's discipline. The faith-fired mist, for example, was often described as clinging to valleys at dawn precisely when temperature inversions create natural fog in Celtic regions. This specificity suggests observed phenomena, not pure invention. Modern stealth operations exploit similar environmental factors, like deploying smoke screens during humidity spikes for optimal coverage. The Celts, attuned to their landscape, likely documented these patterns and codified them into rituals, blending practicality with mysticism to preserve the knowledge. Archaeological finds add weight to the connection. The birdlip mirror, with its precise curvature, could project or scatter light depending on the angle, a tool that might have inspired tales of shields that deflected gazes. Recent lab tests show that when paired with a second mirror, it creates a primitive cloaking effect, making objects behind it appear fragmented. Similarly, Celtic textiles dyed with woad and lichen have been proven to adapt to forest lighting better than modern camouflage in certain conditions. These weren't accidents, they were innovations born of necessity, refined over generations until their origins blurred into legend. The greatest clue, though, lies in the Celtic worldview itself. Unlike cultures that reserved invisibility for gods, their myths treated it as a craft, something learned, earned, or woven. This distinction is crucial. When the Mabinogion describes a cloak's construction in meticulous detail, its threads, dyes, and the loom used, it reads less like fantasy and more like a technical manual in poetic form. The Druids' famed secrecy makes sense if their magic was actually proprietary knowledge, guarded as fiercely as any modern patent. So were the Celts using invisibility tech. Not as we define it today, but they were arguably the first documented practitioners of perceptual warfare, hacking light, sound, and human psychology in ways science is still catching up to. Their legends aren't just stories, they're the frayed edges of a lost curriculum, whispering that the ancient world knew more than we've dared to imagine. From shimmering legends to the cutting edge of science, the Celtic invisibility cloak has traveled an extraordinary path, not as mere fantasy, but as a tantalizing bridge between ancient ingenuity and modern innovation. We began with myths where warriors slipped between worlds under cloaks woven from twilight, where druids commanded mists that swallowed armies whole. Yet with each layer uncovered the precision of Celtic metalwork, the sophistication of their textiles, their mastery over perception and psychology. These stories began to shed their magical veneer, revealing something just as wondrous, a culture operating at the outermost limits of their era's understanding. What once seemed like sorcery now echoes in laboratories where scientists engineer metamaterials to bend light, or in military workshops developing adaptive camouflage. The Celts may not have had our vocabulary for optics or acoustic dampening, but their legends suggest they grasped the principles intuitively, encoding them in tales that outlasted empires. This journey leaves us with a humbling realization. The ancient world was far more technologically inventive than we often assume. The Druids weren't just mystics, they were early scientists, their rituals likely preserving observations about light, sound, and human perception that were only now quantifying. When a Celtic bard sang of a hero vanishing into the breath of the land, he might have been describing a real technique using fog, reflection, and disciplined movement to erase presence. Their myths weren't lies, they were a different language for truths we're still unpacking. So where does that leave us today? In an age where invisibility tech inches closer to reality, these ancient stories gain new resonance. They challenge us to reconsider what primitive truly means and to see the Celts not as naive dreamers, but as keen observers who turned their environment into an ally. Perhaps their greatest legacy is the reminder that innovation isn't always about inventing something new. Sometimes it's about rediscovering what was already known, then lost to time. Now, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Could the Celts have developed early forms of invisibility technology, or were these purely imaginative tales? Have you encountered other ancient myths that seem to predict modern science? Share your theories in the comments. Let's keep the conversation alive. And if this deep dive into the intersection of myth and reality captivated you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more explorations where history meets mystery. The past is full of secrets waiting to be seen, if only we know how to